Just looking at our timetable, what I would propose that we do is that we take Mr. Chinsee's evidence before this committee at this time, following which we will, I'm anticipating it'll take about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will break for lunch. So it's now 11:45, we'll break for lunch somewhere around 12:15 to 12:30. And we'll take no more than 45 minutes. So I'm going to say we'll reconvene at 1:15. So for those of you who in the gallery who are waiting around as witnesses to give testimony, please be back here at 1:15 so that we can reconvene at that time. That okay with members? Comfortable with that? Thank you. Mr. Chinsey, welcome to the Public Accounts Committee, and thank you for attending as a witness here today. For the record, would you please state your name and your position?
Yes, sir. Vinton Chinsey, Chief Financial Officer for the Ministry of Home Affairs.
I'm not sure your microphone is on.
Yeah, Vinton Chinsey, Chief Financial Officer for the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Much better. Thank you for being here, as I said, and members of the committee. I would now open things for you to question this witness. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you. First of all, Mr. Chinsey, can you tell us whether your specific ministry has implemented a policy for management of travel and hospitality expenditures?
Yes, sir. We implemented our first policy in May 2009. It forms the basis of the current policy that is used widely in government. That was the first version that was done, and we revise it pretty much every year around the same time, and we still need to do another revision. But we revise it to take into consideration circumstances at the time and the changes within the ministry.
Thank you.
Mr. Chinsey, you said you have a policy since 2009.
Yes, sir.
But have you implemented processes? I think that really is a critical element of this whole issue. What sort of processes do you have in place to manage the travel and hospitality expenditures?
Well, the policy itself embodies some of that process. It was one of the key things that you have to do when you prepare such a policy is to widely circulate it. So we actually had to educate the members in the ministry and department managers as to what's in the policy and what the process is. In our case, we have a process where the accountable officer, which is the department manager, is responsible for ensuring that all travel and hospitality fits within the confines of the budget, the purpose, and gives good value for money. But in addition to that, we have secondary checks done at the ministry office. In the first version, we didn't have that because we fully had that handled through the departments. But when things got a little tight and we started to cut the budget for travel, etc., we implemented what was then a temporary measure of a secondary check at the ministry to further weed out what we might consider not to be the most essential at that point in time, given the constraints that we faced. So each department, there are forms in place. And whenever a person goes on official travel or is to go, first thing they have to do is to complete this form. And one section of the form captures the purpose or effectively the business case for this travel. And another section captures all the costs related to the trip, not just tickets, but if you have conference fees, etc. And it has approval sections there. And then the final section covers whether or not you require travel advance. So it's one page, one form, but in summary, it captures everything a decision maker needs to know about this particular trip and whether or not it's something that we should be doing. The claim is also separate. After the person has traveled on a duly approved travel, they then must within 7 days submit the claim with all the supporting documentation, receipt, etc. And once they do it, it is reviewed by the accounting staff for consistencies with the policy and purpose. If there's anything that seems to be that requires a secondary check or is questionable, it's immediately flagged. And if the traveling officer does not supply the necessary receipts or the claim, the proper duly completed claim, at the next payroll, it's deducted in full from their salary. And that applies to everyone from constable to deputy governor to chief officer to MLAs.
Question?
Chairman, through you, Mr. Chinsi, it sounds to me that you are fairly clear in your understanding of the PFML law that your entity is responsible for putting in place the necessary policies and controls to ensure that there's compliance and that you can provide assurance to the public that money is being spent with due care and with value for value. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, sir. When I took on the account, I didn't realize it was that bad. We had approximately $200,000 in outstanding travel advance in 2008. Found that to be totally unacceptable. So what I did at the time was to give everyone who had outstanding travel advance, and some of these went back years, a fixed period. I don't remember exactly the period in which they had to submit all their claims. I think it was about 2 or 3 months, after which we started to deduct from salaries. So we went through an intensive exercise that took months to collect and record all of these claims and supporting receipts and invoices, etc. Where there was no support, we deducted it from salaries. In some cases, we deducted over several pay periods. Was highly unpopular. And as a new CFO in a ministry of 1,000 people, you have quite a few angry people when they got less pay. But it had to be done. And immediately, to prevent the problem from happening, sat down and drafted a policy with clear guidelines to everyone as to what should happen if you're going to travel on government business and when and how you should proceed before and how you should continue before and after you have traveled, and what the consequences are should you not follow the proper procedure. Of course, there are exceptions, and there are means of dealing with those exceptions, and there are delegated responsibilities. And so we made all that clear in the policy, and that forms actually the basis of the current policies used widely across government.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, through you. Mr. Chinsi, when did you take office? When did you start in your current role?
June 2008.
When you, I read this report, Mr. Chinsi, and this report to me is, despite all we heard this morning, is much more damning to those who are charged with guarding the funds than those who abused it, to me. During that time, was that all just accepted, or did you feel that your hands were tied if you tried to address the abuses, or you know, was there concerns of being chastised from above if you tried to address those issues?
Actually, in my ministry, quite the contrary. We had full support from the deputy governor who was in charge of our ministry at the time, and our chief secretary, as it was called then as well. And as long as we clearly outlined the purpose and the intent, and it was to support good governance and to actually protect their back as well, because I remember Mr. McCarthy, one of the things I told Mr. McCarthy, some of these things are necessary to ensure that he himself doesn't get in trouble. He was very appreciative of that. Mr. Manderson, likewise, followed all the policies and fully supported. And at times, the chief officer and the deputy governor and the minister, they actually get the less lenient end of the stick, because they not only have to be above board, but appear above board. So if there's any discrepancy where we'd have a discretion to, as management, say to a lower member of staff, okay, yeah, we understand, we will allow this one. When it came to the deputy governor or the chief officer, we say, well, we don't want it to look too funny. So, you know, in your case, you just gonna have to suffer more than the next person would suffer. So, yeah, we had cases where it was difficult, but I never really had a problem once explained to any senior member or MLA what the intent or purpose is, or why we would not support a particular claim, or why a particular expenditure was not wise.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chinsi, now that you are under a minister, has anything changed with regard to what you just explained?
Not really, sir. To be honest, we are on a minister, but I've had occasions where claims may be coming in slow because he might be traveling and his secretary or person supporting persons have not brought in the claims fast enough. And I've had cases where I've said, listen, for the own good of the premier, if this thing doesn't come in by X date, I'm going to have to issue instructions to have it deducted from the premier's salary. And they have usually responded and done it because they know why it needs to be done. But I've not really had that problem. I can't speak for other ministries or other CFOs. They need to speak for themselves. But in our ministry, we've not had that problem and count ourselves fortunate.
Mr. Chinsi, you touched on it briefly, but I'd like to explore this a little bit further with you. The Auditor General in his report acknowledges the presence of a travel policy that was issued in 2013, but states that it does not apply to ministers and elected officials. As a keeper of the public purse, so to speak, how do you deal with the travel of the minister who has responsibility for your ministry?
The auditor is right. The policy that we drafted, did not cater for ministerial travel, so to speak. However, it does cover, I'd say probably 70% of what should still be the same. We never had that problem because as a portfolio, we didn't really have a minister. And even though we had the deputy governor, the chief secretary, travel and official business, we just held them to the same policy. I don't have an issue with the premier travel being under our ministry because he does not travel on behalf of our ministry, as he has not yet done that. He is traveling in his capacity as the premier.
Okay.
However, if you are having a situation where you have ministers, there should be specific guidelines where there are exceptions for ministers and such official members, how you would address those. Because you have to understand, some of those things have to be different. I give you an example. One of the instructions I recently issued was to the London office, which was a new department to us, so they kind of struggled to adapt. But our policy was not written to cater for an office overseas. And I had to issue instructions that, listen, until we can formally put together a proper policy to address certain issues, there are certain things that you should cease doing and we handle them by exceptions until we are able to sit down and properly draft something to cover that. I think we should really, with haste now, in the interest of everyone, to draft proper policy and procedures to cover ministers, because they have to travel and represent Cayman Islands. You don't want a situation where they travel and because of certain policies which are not designed for their type of activity is restricting them from being able to perform their functions or make the Cayman Islands look dreary. I really hate to bring this one up, but take, for example, this whole issue of alcohol. In some circles, I've never gone to a reception for any international agency, and I used to work internationally, where it's not acceptable to have wine with dinner. As a matter of fact, in some places like France, etc., it's an insult if you don't provide wine with dinner. I mean, they take serious exception to it. But sometimes we take things to extreme, and we go against the spirit and go for the literal wording. And I think that's a capacity problem in some cases. You have to sometimes look at the spirit of the law, the spirit of the rule, and the intent, as opposed to what is literally written. And we get ourselves in trouble for that.
Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Chinsey, well, I agree that there should be some updates, especially with the role of counselors now as well.
Yes, sir.
As having been, asked to accompany a minister on official travel, there was no provisions there for counselors. But you said that in some instances, monies were deducted over a period of time for people that owed money on their credit cards. Or
No.
not on their credit cards, sorry, on for their official travel.
Yeah.
Yeah? Reimbursements. And is that a standard across the board now with the new travel policy?
Actually, no. That was only in the interim exception when we had these large volumes in 2009. Going on from now and from then, it's deducted in full at next payroll. Likewise, credit card. It's not a payment plan. We don't arrange payment plans. If you took an advance and you have not accounted for the government's loan, because an advance is technically a loan, we deduct it in full next pay cycle. And if there's more left over, then the additional amount spill over to the following pay cycle. But we don't deduct it over several periods, unless there's an exceptional circumstance that dictate that, and that's extremely rare.
Okay, because I mean, I note in the audit there's several indications that monies were written off,
Yeah.
etc. And I'm just trying to see then again if that's not across the board and a policy and procedure, then I think the audit report then highlights the fact that what you're discussing here should be standardized across the board, and then you wouldn't have to have amounts given in travel advances written off over a period of time. Right?
Yes, but it is in the policy, sir.
Okay.
We specifically put it in the policy, and it's written on the form. Before you get that advance, there's a section on the form that quotes that if you do not submit this, we are going to deduct it, and you sign at that. So it is.
So if that's not taken into consideration, is that negligence on the part of the CFO?
I can't see that.
Through you, Chair, just to answer the Councillor's comments, the issue around travel advances should never allow to happen in the first place. They should be cleared within that period of time. And the way that it was dealt with in I&E was the exception to the rule that we saw. In lots of cases, they were written off.
Yeah, we
but
did
they
write them
took
off.
action to reclaim those. But under the new policy, that situation should not arise, as the travel advances should be cleared within 7 days of returning from travel. Maybe say that's quite extreme in terms of time, but it's certainly within a reasonable period, and that if that's not the case, then it all should be deducted somehow from salary. So that's included in the current policy. I'm not sure about the deductions from salary or anything like that, whether that's actually mentioned, but that may be
No,
more
it is. In
is a
ours it is.
more procedural issue that supports the policy in terms
Yeah.
of getting back those advances.
Thank you.
Since the publication of this report,
Sir.
in your ministry, what are you doing that's different since the report?
Nothing, sir.
You're that confident that the policies and procedures you have in place are sufficient to cover you with your ministry?
Yes, sir. As Mr. Swarbrick would beat upon me when he does his annual audits, because they do check those things and they do ask for the support for travel as a routine part of the annual external audit. In addition, the internal auditors also look at it from time to time, and they are currently reviewing it. I'm not saying everything will be perfect. When you have over 1,000 people, you'll never ever get a situation where all I's are dotted and all T's crossed. But by and large, the wide array of issues that you face are consistent. Breakdown of procedures doesn't usually happen. No.
I think just one final question from me. I'm assuming that you've had a read of the report and the
Yes, sir.
Auditor General's recommendations, but is there anything that you would like to see being done differently? Do you have any recommendations for this committee that we should consider?
Putting me on the spot now, sir. Pretty much some of the things that are recommended, they already start to put some of them in place, and even some that are not. I'll give you an example. All the credit card statements are now proactively published. You don't wait for a request or an FOI to publish it. They're actually published every month. It's one of those things that go out every month. What we used to do before we started publishing them every month is that we knew that an FOI is going to come almost every month for these things. So we just had them queued up. Whenever we get an FOI from the press or anybody, we just send them on. I know that the auditor publishes his travel, etc. And the deputy governor has been doing his as well. I know there is already steps on the way to actually have proactively publish the travel of senior officials. That is one thing that will promote transparency and prevent some of the sort of comments that you may get that are negative. However, you still have to be careful in that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. For example, if you're doing an investigation that is a bit covert, you don't necessarily want to proactively publish those immediately. Likewise, if you're negotiating a very sensitive trade deal and you don't necessarily want your competitors to get their heads up on you, you have to be very careful. So we have to frame it around certain circumstances and be very careful how we do some of these things. In respect of travel, there's some things I would do differently. You need to also recognize, since we're acting more like a corporation these days, a corporation of Cayman Islands, you have to look at some of what businesses actually do. In order to promote themselves, they do have to entertain and stuff like that. We don't effectively manage how we do this. And you have to be careful because you don't want Cayman Islands to look like the poor cousins whenever you have a gathering of peers in the international circles. Because I've seen it where I've gone to regional conferences, etc. Not in my capacity in Cayman Islands, but in previous life. And you could tell the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And since Cayman Islands is a big financial center worldwide, you have to project a certain image. You cannot be bundled with have-nots. And you can actually see that sort of situation or sort of difference. So you have to also protect the image of the Cayman Islands. And there's no point going out there having a conference, let's say in the conference belt in Orlando, which we know the cheapest hotel there is around $269. But because your policy said that, oh, Florida, it's $150, the Cayman staff has to stay 30 miles in the 2-star down the road when everybody else is at the conference hotel and they're commuting. I mean, you have to be practical. So it works for us, but I'm mindful of tourism ministry and those who actually have to court and financial services who have to court high-end people to get business in Cayman Islands.
Yes. Thank you. Auditor General?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add a couple of comments around some of those couple of issues. In terms of things like alcohol, I think our report's not about the consumption of alcohol per se. It's about the lack of clarity about when it's appropriate, the policies around that and things like that. Because it obviously functions when you're entertaining, for example, tourism delegates, whatever else. It's going to be appropriate and it would be part of the normal business practice to do that. But you've got to be clarity about when it's appropriate and demonstrating the value for doing it. And that's the problem. There's no clarity about that. So it leads to lots of discretion and potentially inappropriate use of consumption. And the same for things like the practicalities of situations where you can't get the hotel room within the rate of that's in the policy. And the policy does give you discretion to document it, but it's about the documentation of that and providing an argument. For example, I've had to do that myself when I've had to overnight in Miami on business travel because the hotel rates in Miami that night were above the threshold for Miami, and you couldn't get a hotel room at a reasonable accommodation. And we're talking about we don't want to put people in the local dives. You know, you're on business travel. You've got to have some reasonable standard of accommodation. So you have to. It's about demonstrating the value and the benefit, the purpose, and justifying it. It's not about not being able to do certain things. It's about justifying it.
Other questions? Mr. Chinsey, you have something further to say?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. And he's right in that in the policy, there are mechanisms to deal with the exceptions. Right? For example, if you have to stay in an area where the hotel is in excess of the amount, in our policy, that can be approved once the circumstances are presented by the chief officer or the chief financial officer, etc. So there are mechanisms to deal with the exceptions. It's just that we need to make sure that they're in place and actually use them where necessary. You cannot write a policy to cater for 100% of everything, but you get 90% and then you handle the 10% by exception.
Members of the committee, any other questions for Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Chinsey. How do you, in practice, verify when somebody brings a business case to you for travel and you have to approve that? Like, what's your level of discretion? And have you ever said, well, there is no business case for this, in my opinion, so you need to take it higher than to the chief officer or to the ministry? I mean, again, you're guarding the public purse, so to speak, and people will come to you from time to time with travel and just put, well, you know, for business. How do you determine whether or not it's a justifiable business case?
Well, the first thing is that you have to get past my staff. Usually they will just stop you right there and say, listen, you're wasting your time sending this any further. It will not get approved. Go back and fix it and put your case in. So usually those don't actually reach to me. But in an exceptional circumstances where they do, we will reject them, and we have done so in the past. Sometimes it's just in most cases, it's just a lack of the person just being lazy to properly document the thing, right? So we will ask necessary questions. We will first reject, and then if they can convince us otherwise, then we'll approve. There are cases where it has to go up further. If I still don't agree with it, there may be some information that the chief officer may have that I may not have, or somebody else that we consult like deputy chief officer may have. Then they will then weigh that in. And we have had a few cases like that we have dealt with them, but by and large we don't really have many where we have problems. Recognize also where we have one of the biggest travelers in our ministry are the police. There are cases where we have worked out systems with them where we actually code certain things with only enough details for us to know the intended purpose, but not to reveal something that they may be investigating or something like that. But or a witness they may be protecting. So we have to be careful with those as well. We can't put people's names where we're protecting witnesses in those.
But do you agree then on page 8 under the policy and procedures, paragraph 24, where the Auditor General was stating that, in time they found that officials were not required to formally document their justification for business travel or consideration of other options. And the part I'm asking you if you agree with is the what they list as what they would have expected to see, because it seemed from reading this report that, again, going back to policies and procedures, in some instances you seem to be the exception to the norm.
Yeah, I can't state that I'm the exception. I mean, because I don't have access to the other records to which the Auditor General, he will have to state that. But in our cases, and I'm not saying that everything is perfect, but we require that as a part of it. And it's usually labeled as purpose. If you're going to the BRAC as a police officer to provide one-day training to some officers over there in, let's say, firearms, you don't need an elaborate business case compiling 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. It's an administrative burden. And this is one of the reasons why I put the policy in place. But in respect of what the auditor found, I have no reason to doubt what he has written, but I can't attest to it. He can speak for that.
Auditor General.
I think we generally found that there was no documentation to support what the purpose of the travel was, and even subsequent to the travel, there was no documentation to support what the basis of the travel was. Like, for example, no airfare, no airplane receipts, air ticket receipts, hotel receipts, or even conference schedules, things like that. In terms of, for example, if I was talking about myself, in terms of our business cases aren't long; they're quite short because it's then generally pretty clear what the purpose of the travel is. But it normally includes, for example, a copy of the schedule for the meetings, the conference, etc., and the request, the invitation to go, things like that. And it's all basic documentation that you normally provide to that, and the benefit. We do talk about the benefit we're going to get from it. But they're lucky if they're 2 paragraphs, generally speaking. It's quite straightforward in lots of the cases. It's because it's the same stuff that we do all the time. And and I completely agree with Mr. Chinsey. Like if you go to the BRAC for an audit, it's not really a detailed business case. We're going to the BRAC to audit the district administration. It's about all we had to put down on our travel for it as a business case, because it has to be done. You don't have any choice in that. So it's all about being the perspective and being appropriate to the circumstances in terms of that. But it needs to have something to demonstrate what you are actually doing at the end of the day and the purpose.
Any other questions for this witness? Mr. Chinsey, thank you very much for appearing before the committee today and for giving your testimony. I appreciate your time, appreciate your patience. It's taken us a while to get to you, other than the start time we gave you. But you're excused, and thank you very much. Members of the committee, it is now 12:15, and we're going to go ahead and take the lunch break, and we will reconvene at 1 p.m. sharp. Thank you.